Welcome. Welcome to the Faith and Works podcast, sponsored by the Interfaith Leadership Council of Metropolitan Detroit. Today, we will explore the impact of the COVID era on religious practice and spirituality with four young people. Our moderator this morning will be Saeed Khan. Saeed is the senior lecturer in Near Eastern Studies and the director of global studies at Wayne State University. Saeed?
Thanks so much, Bob, for having me moderate this, and welcome all who are listening in, and welcome to a really wonderful panel of, as Bob said, given the fact that he and I are the two older ones here, young people, to talk about a certain element of faith. And today what we're going to be examining is COVID-19 as a pandemic and how it informs our sense of spirituality and faith. How has it, if at all, affected and impacted our relationship to spirituality and faith, and really vice versa? How has spirituality and faith helped us, and particularly here with young people, cope with this pandemic, arguably an unprecedented event in everybody's lives, creating a shared sense of community, ironically enough, as a result of that, irrespective of people having different and diverse religious traditions. We're joined today by four wonderful young people. We will go around and hear a little bit about them, starting with, and I'm looking at this from my perspective as Bob's had mentioned offline, a kind of Hollywood Squares or a Brady Bunch, if you will, confirmation. So let's go ahead and start first with Kelsey Dovico. Good morning, and why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what brought you here?
Thanks, Saeed. Good morning, and thank you for including me in this podcast. I am here because I did some volunteering with Wendy Miller-Gamer of the Interfaith Leadership Council a couple years ago on her program, Religious Diversity's Journeys. Interfaith collaboration is a big area of personal passion for me. It's one of the primary themes in my life, and I'm really excited to contribute to this conversation.
Wonderful, thank you. Next, we're joined, if we're going sort of, depending on your vantage point, counterclockwise on the board. Next, we'll hear from Moriah Carpenter. Hi, Moriah.
Hi, thank you also for having me here. This is a wonderful opportunity. I also have connections with Wendy through Religious Diversity Journeys. I volunteered there a couple of times, and she connected me to them.
Excellent, thank you. Next, we'll hear from Imaan Singh.
Hi, thank you for having me. My connection to Interfaith Leadership Council and the Faith and Works podcast is I've been working with them for the last couple of months. It's been an incredible and rewarding experience for sure. And I practice with the Sikh faith, so I'm really excited to discuss about that.
Excellent, and welcome. And last but not least, Farid Alsabeh.
Thank you, Saeed, and thanks for having me. First of all, I have to say you are confirming my suspicion that all academics must have an impressive array of books behind them. It seems to be some kind of an unspoken rule among you guys. But my name's Farid, as you mentioned. I'm a graduate of a religious diversity journey experience in 7th grade, and that's how I got in touch with Wendy. I'm a practicing Muslim, and my faith is really important to me. So I'm looking forward to this discussion and what it'll bring.
All right, thank you. And you're absolutely right. I mean, although it's not part of our contract, we do have to have bookshelves in the background, and they do have to be real. It cannot be one of those fake screens, except I have noticed that some of the same bookshelves appear in other academics' backgrounds. I don't know if they're replicating or if they're cloning other people's backgrounds, but it's turned into a cottage industry all on its own. Okay, well, so we're talking about COVID and we're talking about spirituality and faith. So let's go ahead and just begin right away. How has COVID made you think about, rethink about your spirituality and faith? Has it served as an affirmation? Has it caused a reduction, a reassessment, maybe an amplification? So I'm just going to go ahead and randomly pick, and again, with no forethought here. How about Moriah? You've been the one nodding the most here.
Yeah, I've been thinking about it a lot too because of our conversation the other day. And I would definitely say that through COVID, I have recognized kind of the importance of the finite. Because I think, so I practice Christianity, I forgot to say that. And I go to Geneva Presbyterian. And I think a lot of my upbringing was, we are here to determine eternity, you know? So like, we're just here to just kind of, it just is kind of passing, you know? And I think that kind of invalidated the way that I saw the world and the importance of it. And so I think it kind of just like being by myself and but also connecting to people virtually, and we're all doing this together still. It has just made me realize how important other people and this world truly are, and how willing are we to go to help and to, or just to stay home to help somebody else that we do not know, you know.
So now you talk about the spiritual, but very interestingly, you also then made a reference really to the material, the idea of the worldly, that here we are, perhaps sometimes people focus too much on the material at the expense of the spiritual. And at the same time, it seems as though in some faith traditions, the emphasis on the spiritual means that we forget about the importance and the connection of the material, about the here and now as sort of a gateway to the afterlife, or to even the spiritual. Imaan, how do you see that within your faith?
So I think that we've been practicing less, like going to our Gurdwara where we practice. Instead, it's been an increase in spirituality and an increase in community, actually.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm just going to have to go ahead and, in case the audience is unfamiliar, you mentioned Gurdwara, which is, probably a 20-point Scrabble word. So why don't you go ahead and unpack that, as well as what faith tradition?
So it is where the individuals who practice Sikhi, they go there to worship, or to pray, or to increase their spirituality. So we haven't been able to go in person, so they've been holding virtual sessions where we can listen in on the hymns or the prayers that are going on. Or we've been having a lot more seva events. So seva means selfless service. So it's a way to increase our community service and connect with each other in a way that'll help and impact our community. And it's actually been an interfaith type of outreach. So we've had people from all different faiths and backgrounds come together. So actually increased our interfaith relationships more, which I really appreciate, because for me, what I believe is that each religion, faith, or spirituality is a vehicle to reach enlightenment or to or peace. And so I think that that's definitely increased because I've been hearing from different backgrounds and different faiths and learning more throughout the pandemic.
So in a sense, Imaan, then, is it safe to say that the spiritual is manifested in the material, in the service elements of your faith, and that COVID has allowed that to, with the exception, of course, the lockdowns and some of the quarantines, allowed the spirituality to come forth even more because of the imperative to the service?
I believe so. In the beginning, obviously, there was a lot of anxiety, and I think that everyone was really unsure of what was going on. So I think everyone kind of leaned into what grounded them. And for me, that was my Sikh faith. And that was kind of how it worked for me.
Excellent. Kelsey, I know that you and I have spoken before about the idea of your faith being applied through a lot of the humanitarian concerns that you have, a lot of the humanitarian work. So how have you seen that then impacted by COVID?
That's a great question. Well, at the beginning of COVID, immediately I was laid off because I had been working in the school system. And I quickly found a job at a food bank helping do emergency food distributions for kids at schools who weren't getting free breakfast and lunches. So that was, a very quick turnaround in me trying to, feel like I was contributing to the solution when there was so much uncertainty and chaos and fear and lots of people in really difficult situations. It was very important to me to mobilize and do something tangible. for me, I've found a lot of, because my interfaith background has not really found me fitting nicely into any one religious community, the idea of operationalizing religious and spiritual values is the primary way I get to practice in my life. So it's been important to me. After that, I did that briefly, and then I found another job working, doing substance abuse prevention for youth in Metro Detroit. And it's been really important to me to use then this new job as a vehicle for how can I get out, advocacy and information and resources for teens who are, teens are kind of our target population, who are, struggling maybe more so with this pandemic because they're not in control of many aspects of their life in terms of like agency and being an adult, and they have to do distance learning, and just adolescence in general so stressful. So it's been a fruitful opportunity to give to the world, and that is one of the silver linings for me.
Now, you mentioned that you come from an interfaith background. Would you mind sharing which faiths are involved within that combination?
Sure, there aren't many that I haven't touched on in my lifetime. I grew up in a household, my mom practiced Lutheranism and then got really invested in the unity movement of Christianity. My dad grew up and was confirmed as a Catholic. When I was 13 or 14, I became really interested in Buddhism. From there, I explored the Baha'i faith in college, got into Judaism when I met a friend who was pretty conservative. Through my own yoga and meditation practice, have become interested in Hinduism and Jainism. I worked with a counselor who was Taoist. The only major religious tradition I haven't invested a lot of study in is Islam, although I've participated in a iftar dinner,
Sure.
breaking the fast at the end of Ramadan with some of my friends. So I agreed with what Imaan said earlier about each religion kind of having one puzzle piece of this, bigger concept of God or the divine or the universal forces. And it's very important to me not to reject any of it. Although I don't feel like I fit well in one, I have come to determine, particularly in the isolation of quarantine, that instead of not belonging anywhere, I now feel like I belong everywhere.
So it's interesting. I'm sure many of you are familiar that given the uniqueness of 2020, people are talking about various things that are happening and talking about bingo cards. It seems like you've got almost an entire bingo card of faiths marked off. So well done you. Farid, I think one of the areas where Kelsey is looking to really bolster her bingo card of faiths is Islam, and you mentioned that you're a practicing Muslim. So how has COVID then impacted your understanding of Islam, and particularly your level of spirituality and practice?
So first I want to say I really like something that Moriah said, which was that the pandemic has given her the opportunity to reflect on the finite. And the reason I like that is because for me, I've always understood my own faith and religion in general as being a framework for grappling with existential questions. So finitude, of course, is a huge existential theme. What it's like to be materialized in this body in the face of the conception of the infinite, which we may or may not have access to. And she spoke to how the pandemic has incited in her some reflections on finitude. For me, the biggest thing that the pandemic has made me reflect on, and which my religious faith is giving me an ability to grapple with, is the radical contingency of the human condition. You talked about the worldly. And I think that in our very technologically capable society, we do have the sense that we're in control. Infectious diseases come up, we have antibiotics. We need to get across a river, we have a bridge. But now, to speak roughly here, halfway across the world, one small mutation happens in a pangolin somewhere, and then the whole world is basically, on life support. So that to me has been where my personal faith has come in, is really dealing with, okay, what do we do about this situation? The fact that we're so contingent in this world. Personally, I think that Islam's faith is that in the Quran you find a very clear blueprint for self-becoming. I think if you read into the spiritual aspects of it, it allows you to, in prayer, really reflect on who you are and how you're responding to different situations in your life. And to put it very simply, I think that the pandemic is an opportunity for everyone to try to be their best selves and to really just treat this with as much sensitivity and goodwill as possible. I think the silver lining has been, if we can use this as an opportunity to be as kind and just, considerate to each other as possible, then maybe in this pandemic we'll have an opportunity to grow as people.
Well, you mentioned the Quran, Farid, and in Islamic tradition, the notion of challenges usually doesn't come with a value judgment of pain and suffering compared to bliss and exaltation. Everything is presented as a test. Even if there's something that is seen as a positive, you are tested about whether or not you are appreciative of the bounty that you're given. And if it is something that is a challenge, then it is a test of character, it is a test of faith. How has that concept informed your, for lack of better terms, coping mechanism with COVID?
Yeah, it's true. There's a good verse in the Quran, I don't remember where, but it basically says it's chastising the non-believers, and it's saying when good is done to you, you're ungrateful, and when bad is done to you, you complain, right? So exactly right. And here I want to introduce the word fitna, because as far as I can understand, that's the term that the Quran uses for trial, and I think that's a good way of putting it, is everything that happens in this life, whether it's a crazy pandemic or getting laid off from your job or going through a messy breakup, is a trial. And really the reason why religion exists is because it provides us with a scaffolding to go through that trial as good as possible. In my own life, this is basically how I pray. When I pray, of course, I say the Fatiha and I say some verses from the Quran, but really, when I'm in sujood especially, I think to myself, what has been done to me and how can I be grateful for the good and still appreciative and as, thoughtful and considerate as possible through the bad. So that is essentially what Islam is to me.
Okay, so just as a point of clarification, for some of the terms used here, Fatiha is the opening verse of the Quran, which is cited in every prayer, and sujood is the act of prostration within the prayer. So you mentioned this idea then about how the notion of testing grounds you, particularly recognizing that all of humanity at some point is tested, as have our predecessors. Kelsey, you mentioned that you come in contact with young people, many who are in quite dire straits. And a very common refrain is when we hear about these things, why do bad things happen to good people? Why is there suffering in the world? I was wondering how much of that you have been encountering in your work, or maybe yourself, and how do you then frame COVID and your faith and spirituality in reconciling these things?
Wow. Okay. Yeah, the question of why do innocents suffer is particularly when I started exploring Buddhism and the Four Noble Truths, one of which is suffering exists and it's a part of life. And to kind of bounce off of what Farid was saying, that different faith traditions provide a framework to usher people through the experiences of life. And we use different lexicon and vocabulary and kind of like, mythology is not the right word, but, what is the word I want? The hero's journey, is conceptualized in different ways in faith traditions. And one of the, primary questions is how to get through difficult situations. And I think it's, part of our humanness to not really understand why, when we see people who are disenfranchised, disempowered, disadvantaged, why they suffer, why some people suffer more and some people suffer less. A lot of my professional experience has been working with marginalized cultural communities, particularly teenagers. And it is, I suppose, a question that I have not been able to answer through faith or any sort of faith tradition, because I am not finding myself subscribing to any particular sort of dogmatic structure about they suffered because they have an accumulation of karma, for example, in Hinduism, or they suffer because they need to be redeemed through Christianity. None of that seems to fit, more of the humanitarian aim of my life. So in seeing teens now in my current work who are very prone to falling into the addiction cycle, who are dealing with poverty, who are dealing with not having access to technology and falling behind in school, it can be a challenge to stay, emotionally buoyant, trying to be a supporter and an organizer for teens in our community. But I do think that the aspects of faith that help usher us and help us see ourselves as part of a larger picture, even if it's a larger picture that we can't necessarily identify with words or understand with concepts, but that there are, forces in the world, in existence, that I'm kind of losing my train of thought as I'm speaking. Maybe we should cut this part out.
No. I mean, one of the things that I've found with spirituality and faith is that if we can go ahead and articulate everything with our limited language and vocabulary, we must be doing something wrong. I think that spirituality and faith, by definition, ironically, should leave things undefined. They should leave things that are beyond the convenience of explanation. They should have what the French have given us this phrase, there should be always a je ne sais quoi, right? I don't really know how to define it. I don't know how to describe it. I mean, because of the scope and the scale that we're involved with. So yeah, please do not ever apologize for not coming up with the right terminology to go ahead and express feelings of faith. So Moriah, I'd like to pick up with this concept then about both the indescribability of what's going on, as well as asking the question that here we are in the moment with COVID, and irrespective of how the disease began, now we are, depending on your timeline, 9 months, 12 months, 6 months into this global pandemic. To borrow from Farid, if it started from a mutation in a pangolin, that's something for the epidemiologists and for the vaccine creators to worry about. How much of it is our concern, or should it be a concern, about the theological causality of pandemic? How important is it for us to ask the question, why did this cosmologically happen?
Yeah.
I know a lot of people are asking these questions. They're putting value judgments to them. Is it for us to spend that time to consider? If so, how much time? Or how much of it should be really rolling up the sleeves and moving forward and try to make the best of it?
Yeah, first thing, I think it is really important to add on to what you were saying about how I definitely believe that if you start saying that this is exactly what God thinks or what God is, I highly question that, even though people can say that they think that I have like a weaker faith for maybe questioning some of the things that they think are just absolute. But I think that everything that we think, God will always transcend. God is not a feeling of thought of any of that. So I think that was a very important part that you pointed out. But yeah, definitely, I've been thinking about it more so because of the conversation that we've had. And I think I've really, of course, we have in Christianity kind of the Book of Job. Farid was talking about, and you were talking about how this is just kind of a test, and like how willing are we to like kind of keep our faith, or you know, and but there's something specific in the Book of Job that I always kind of lean on, I can't exactly remember the verse, but it's like, where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? And so the question is, like, we really just don't know, you know? So personally, I don't think that I dwell on these why questions as much as maybe other people do because of that.
It's a tough call, isn't it? Because on the one hand, you could essentially go down the rabbit hole of spending all your time wondering why it happens, why it doesn't happen, and then placing value judgments. You know, all the tsunamis and all the floods that happen in Bangladesh, should one infer that these must be really, really bad people if this is happening to them all the time? Have they not learned? And yet at the same time, as people who are spiritual beings and imbued with a sense of faith, it's always, it seems important to try to assess that these are not acts that are random, that they have some causality to them, and that these are also, as we are tested, that these are lessons to be learned in order to correct our ways. Imaan, I once saw a poster, and I'm going to go ahead and paraphrase it because in case Bob wants to keep this thing PG or PG-13, well, actually now PG-13 would know what this is as well. And it's a poster of comparing all the different religions. And it talks about stuff happens and how each religion then has a different take on this. How does your Sikh faith locate the causality of what is happening? How does it frame it within terms of, is this a bad thing? Is this a good thing? Is this a suffering thing? Is this a cleansing thing? I mean, I know that some people are looking at this with the glass half full, saying, look, the environment is getting a much needed break. So how does your faith inform that?
Well, I guess sometimes there is an explanation for why things happen, but one thing that is explained is that nothing is guaranteed. So sometimes we don't get to know why there is suffering, why there is pain. It's about how we navigate it and what we do with it and how we remain content throughout pain, throughout suffering, throughout happiness, throughout whatever is going on in our life. And the way we navigate it is by basically 3 pillars that we have in the Sikh faith, which is Naam Japna, Van Chako, and Kirat Karo. So Naam Japna means to pray and to meditate and to repeat the name of the Lord. And then Kirat Karo means to live an honest living, work hard no matter what. And Van Chakna means to give back to your community. Make sure you're always giving back. No matter what you're going through in your life, just at least give 10% of what you can to give back. And so for us, it's about how you navigate it versus trying to always explain why. Sometimes there is an explanation. Sometimes you need to know that, but sometimes we don't get that. It's about how we come to terms with it, how we come to peace with that.
So the elegance of the 3 pillars in Sikhism suggest a kind of balance that one should have, that there's an obligation or a relationship with God to remember his name. There is an obligation or an imperative for industry, meaning being productive. And then there's also an imperative for you to maintain character and integrity. Do you ever find with instances like COVID that becomes imbalanced?
Yeah, absolutely. Life is always about trying to maintain that balance, and it's never going to be perfect, but it's always about trying to find a way to restore that balance and a way to uplift certain parts that are lacking, you know? So I think that for me, like I said previously, the community aspect and the interfaith relations and the community service definitely increased, and the anxiety increased when the spirituality wasn't there. So it's all about, like, when you have that sense of anxiety or guilt or whatever emotion you're feeling, it's about finding out what's missing, what's lacking, and where do I need to fill in those gaps. And whenever This isn't, of course, this may be different for different people, but for me, whenever I reflect back and I see what's missing and I try and fill in that gap, it reduces whatever emotion I'm feeling and it helps me remain content.
So the sense of balance also exists in Islam, Farid, and the notion then of even acts of faith, the rituals, whether it is prayer or fasting or giving alms, all of them have, of course, a very personal, a very intimate, a very individual component to them, but they also have a certain communal benefit. After all, according to Islamic tradition, the spiritual reward for praying in congregation is 27 times more than it is praying alone, in order to help reinforce that sense of the social. Similarly, giving alms cleanses one of their own wealth, and then, of course, benefits others. And fasting, although it's your own stomach that grumbles, coming into T-1 hour of breaking your fast, the fact that people fasting together really helps carry you over that threshold, because you can empathize and everyone's doing it together. So I was wondering that, given that there's such a strong communal element within Islam, do you find that with the restrictions of COVID, that has compromised some of that balance for you?
So first I want to say my views on religion makes it so that the subjective experience of the adherent is primary. So with that framework, how I understand these aspects of community as you've laid them out is community allows groups of adherents to come together in dialogue with each other about their own personal faith. To me, that's how I understand the value of community. There probably are some other aspects of community values as they pertain to Islam, but for me, when I think of the value of coming together for a Friday prayer, for example, or the value of breaking the fast together, it's an opportunity for people to come together and specifically, in my perfect world, talk about how their prayer has been going. What kinds of themes came up in your prayer? What things are happening in your life that you feel maybe are unjust? What things in your life are happening that maybe you feel you don't deserve how good it is? And this brings us back to the topic of balance, because to me, I've always thought of the Fatiha as a kind of like orienting verse, where when you repeat it over and over again in prayer, you're orienting yourself on the Sirat al-Mustaqim, or the straightforward path. The two, things that you're balancing to hit this perfect straight mark for me is perfectly encapsulated in the last line of the chapter, which I'm sure you know. God grant me the path of those whom you have bestowed favor, not of those with whom you have become angry, or of those whom are lost. So for me, existentially, what I feel when I recite that line is there are aspects of myself that I say, this is amazing, this is a blessing from God, whether it's my innate capabilities, whether it's something nice that happened to me that day. But also, to be a integrated, well-rounded person, you also have to admit that there are some parts of yourself that, under a religious framework, you could think of it as, this is the wrath of God. You got impatient and said something out of frustration. You have neglected a certain part of yourself and now you've hurt someone, right? Under the Islamic conception, and really what Islam gives to you is an opportunity to say, hey, think of those parts of yourself as subjected to the wrath of God. So that to me is what balance is in Islam. It's following the straightforward path between the two extremes of God's blessing and God's wrath. And as far as the community is concerned, I think the benefit of coming together with other religious adherents is you're brought into a dialogue about those aspects of your life in a way that, frankly, you're not able to do secularly. I mean, to be honest, if you were to tell someone in a non-religious setting, oh, I meditated and I'm feeling kind of guilty about this aspect of my life, or, oh, I'm feeling really good, maybe with certain crowds that would fly, but for the most part, it's not really culturally acceptable. So those are my views on balance and community as they pertain to Islam.
So that's really interesting. You're talking about getting together with people and having these kinds of deep conversations that explore elements of spirituality. Obviously, COVID has made some of those opportunities a little bit more of a challenge. Some of it has migrated online. Mosque as a central convening place has, of course, now those kinds of limitations. So if I can ask the question, would that have been a place where you would have been inclined to have the kinds of deliberations before? Or to use a term that is gaining increasing currency, would you consider yourself to be unmosqued, even pre-COVID, that most of your engagement with the kind of passions and the kind of intellectual explorations and spiritual explorations, you find other platforms, other venues for that?
So actually, I am quite comfortable using the mosque as a forum for me to discuss with people what I've said. And really the way that it usually happens is I'll present a certain aspect of my experience or part of myself. And to put it crudely, I'll say, what do you think God thinks of this? Now, Moriah has already brought up that we have to be very careful in speaking of these terms, because strictly speaking, anyone who claims to know what God thinks about a particular thing, especially something as mundane as, the way I treated someone today, maybe out of negligence or ignorance, that's, a dangerous game to play. But better to think of it as an ongoing dialectic of trying to figure out what, in the sight of an infinitely just cosmic witness, is the moral status of your action. So, for example, I would go up to someone and say, hey, this was my reaction to something. What do you think God would have to say about this? What do you think? Do you think this is more God's wrath territory or God's blessing territory? And I have to say that I think Islam, again, provides a brilliant blueprint for how to think about these aspects. Essentially, the task of a Muslim is to live their life such that by the end of it, if you are presented a record of everything that you've thought and done, you are able to use the metaphor introduced in the Quran, present it with your right hand, meaning you can present it knowingly and proudly, having anticipated this moment, as opposed to in your left hand, which is to give it up hesitantly, right? So this idea that you are ultimately beholden to some notion of infinite justice on the day of resurrection, that is a great framework to understand your own experience and to really evaluate yourself morally and spiritually. And again, that is the benefit of going to a mosque for me, is with other Muslims, you're able to speak in these terms, to put it roughly, like, oh, was this aspect of myself on Sirat al-Mustaqim or not? And how, if not, can I get more in that direction?
Now, Moriah, you had mentioned this notion of the finite. And I'm always struck by how, when we look at things spiritually, it seems as though many religions fall into this binary. Either it is all good, all bad, as Farid was describing, between the wrath and the beneficence of God, between the ideas of good and evil. Is that something that COVID helps reinforce, or should we be rethinking this as perhaps, and I'm not trying to, of course, be disrespectful here, but that God exists on a spectrum, that there are shades of how we need to then locate not only our own spirituality, but the challenges by which we then learn how to deal with them?
Yes, I have definitely adopted like a mysticism, even over the past summer, kind of deepening my understanding. I think you're kind of speaking of like like dichotomies and the kind of like a dualist like frame. When I would have considered myself kind of like a monistic, even though I still consider myself Christian, which is a monotheistic religion, technically. You know, but so like kind of this monism thinking, like having like our world and having the infinite, like the infinite and the finite are essentially one. So I think that kind of having like these relative terms of like good and evil, I think they have a place here on Earth. You know, I mean, in our creation story, we took the fruit of good and evil and all of that. But personally, I mean, my own kind of theology is that we are one with God, and so our actions are, you know.
Okay. Kelsey, Farid had talked about the notion of the mosque being a venue, which he certainly avails himself of using. What about the concept of, especially given the kind of interfaith odyssey that you've taken, the notion of being unchurched or unbuildinged or unstructured? I don't want to say unstructured, because that, again, seems to connote that you're taking on a kind of an amorphous configuration. How important are those kinds of physical structures for not only your spirituality and faith, but the way that you then process COVID?
Well, I will say, I think a big part of the reason I like embarked on this interfaith odyssey is because I felt so out of place in the church I grew up in. And I was like, I appreciated the benefits of having a spiritual and religious community around me. Like Farid was saying, people who understand the worldview and the lexicon that you are using to conceptualize your life, and the how enriching it is to be able to come together in community and have these you know, kind of encounters with these big existential, like life course directing concepts. And I really wanted that. I wanted to belong somewhere. I wanted to fit somewhere. I wanted to have a Sangha community that I could go to regularly and build and be a part of. And so when I was younger, particularly in adolescence, when I was like kind of stripping away the idea of maybe I'm not Christian, so what am I? You know, I was looking everywhere. I was looking everywhere for what I was. And through college, beyond graduation, that quest continued. But I think over time, as I started picking up pieces of spiritual practice from these different religious traditions and finding that, wow, I resonate with a lot of different styles of practice and a lot of different groups of people and a lot of different conceptualizations of things, it became, I guess, more secondary. That said, it can still feel kind of isolating and lonely, particularly because of the like unchurched or unmosqued, you know, phenomenon we see in a lot of like millennial generations, my generation. You know, not only do I not have like a church that I fit in with, but there's also not a lot of like people my age who are really open to the ideas that I live my life by, you know. So not to say that I don't have friends and like people I feel in community with who are very strongly invested in a religious or spiritual path. But I have found myself kind of almost censoring myself around certain groups of friends or, you know, certain groups of folks, because I'm like, I don't know if I can connect with them in this deeper, very important and kind of vulnerable way, since I don't have, you know, it's just kind of like me and the little piecemeal things that I have, you know. So
do you think that groupthink that's creating that sense of reticence, is that based on the fact that those individuals have a membership to, say, a church or some actual physical institution, or do you think it's a generational thing, or is it a combination of those? I mean, are you having these okay boomer moments when it comes to discussing spirituality and faith? I'll explain to you later, Bob.
I mean, I guess I would hesitate to put it that way, but to be honest, yes. So it can be frustrating to me, the divisiveness between like people who see religion or spirituality as being kind of like, you know, placebo structures for life, or something that is too airy-fairy to actually like believe in or engage in any credible way. It's particularly interesting too when we bring in the idea of community values, and a lot of, you know, people who I really care about who wouldn't necessarily say that religion or spirituality is something that people should do, also uphold really high humanitarian and compassionate values. They want to be loyal, honest, hardworking people, which are, you know, values operationalized in different faith structures. So it can be a little frustrating for me sometimes when I'm like, we're talking about the same thing. Why won't you take me seriously? You know?
Because you're young, because you're a child. Isn't that the usual rejoinder?
I think some of it, yes. Some of it is particularly in the aspects of my social world that are more connected to very traditional or conservative religious values. They're kind of like, oh, you've, you know, gone away from the path. Or like not honoring tradition, not honoring how things are done, and kind of like making up your own world to live in, not living in the real world, is a refrain that I hear frequently. So,
fully agreed. And I don't know where that real world exists. Moriah, you seem to be nodding vigorously too.
This conversation is really, I think, is incredibly important. So I think that a lot of, you know, when people use thinkers like Freud and Marx kind of saying that religion is a neurosis or religion is the opium of the people, those, from my experience, I mean, I don't know, I'm not like a Freudian or like a Marx expert, so I can't speak for them particularly, but the people that use those kinds of arguments, I have seen experience religious trauma. And so I don't really judge anyone for thinking that they need to leave an environment that isn't doing anything for them. Because personally, I was also unchurched, and it wasn't until I found a church that wanted to atone for what the church has done to people. What we have said was okay in the past, you know, it just is interesting. But so I think that like a lot of people, like what Kelsey was saying, a lot of people think that like, oh, this generation is just like the older, kind of like older conservative Christians of like my family, or the evangelicals that I see, they kind of just are like, wow, this generation is wicked. They are just like seeing this truth and not wanting it just because like they just want to be worldly, all of those things. When, even though this may be controversial, but personally, I think that the question should be like not, it should more so be like, how has the church responded to the needs of the people, and has it actually met those, you know? And I think that like finding a church, like I couldn't go to a church that didn't ask those questions. And
so it seems like there's another dichotomy between the woke and the wicked. That's
right.
around generations. So Bob, I'm going to bring you into this as a reference point. So once upon a time, there used to be a band called the Beatles. Some of you may have heard of them. And John Lennon once famously or infamously said that we're more popular than God. That evoked an awful lot of backlash. People started burning Beatles records. I don't know if they realize how valuable those were now as collectors' items. And he had to go ahead then and issue a clarification. He said, look, I'm not saying this as I'm in competition with God or with Jesus Christ, or that we are somehow the other superior, but it is a social commentary like what Marx was making, like what Freud was making, that right now, if you went to particularly young people who back then were in fact boomers, that for them, the Beatles meant more than did God, and perhaps, as Moriah, you were saying, it requires then the churches to hit the update button on their operating system. That how do we now create a language and create an ethos and a culture that is welcoming. Imaan, I've never heard of the term ungurdwared, and perhaps that speaks volumes for how central it is within the Sikh faith, and how it always accommodates and welcomes and encourages the participation of young people. So that's the good news. Another element of good news is that it then becomes this intergenerational space. But just as Kelsey was a little bit hesitant to dish it out, do you find any challenges as a young Sikh with the older generations and the way that you then are able to occupy space within the Gurdwara?
Well, something really interesting is the reason you don't really hear the term ungurdwared is because Sikhi isn't supposed to be a traditional religion or monotheism in the sense that we think about it in Western culture. It's actually supposed to be a way of life. So you should be able to practice anywhere. And the point of the Gurdwara is actually to bring everyone into a safe space if they need it, and to provide a sangat or a group of people you can meet and congregate with, and to allow all walks of faith to practice. So actually, COVID kind of helped shake things up because we were kind of getting caught up in that traditional Western religion kind of practice, which is not how Sikhi is supposed to be practiced. Actually, kind of going home and having to practice on your own created a deeper sense of actually history for us, because for most of our history, we were persecuted. We didn't have the opportunity to go to Gurdwara and practice because of war or persecution, or just there were a time that there was a bounty on 6 heads in India. So we really had to learn how to practice everywhere. And having COVID kind of shook things up for us, and kind of made us go back to our roots and remember, what is Sikhi supposed to be about? What is it? What are we actually practicing for? What are we supposed to be practicing? And are we doing that in the way we're supposed to? And that kind of brings me back to the generational thing. So something that the elder generation may have gotten caught up with was practicing and tradition. And sometimes with that comes along cultural issues. And we need to separate culture and religion for us, and culture and faith, because culture comes with racism, sexism, bigotry, and all those different things. And Sikhi isn't that. And sometimes that gets caught up in, and that's why it's really important to separate the two. So that's the struggle with the generational issues. And I think that the younger generation kind of questions a lot of those traditions that necessarily aren't associated with Sikhi, but Punjabi culture or Western culture as a whole. So it's really interesting because it's not necessarily disagreeing with the elder generation. It just provides a different perspective and makes us really reevaluate the difference between culture and religion and or faith or spirituality.
Yeah, I think that COVID, at least for me, is operating from providing moments and opportunities for clarity, where you're able to distill really the distinction between needs and wants, maybe trying to tweeze out what is really a spiritual issue, what is a cultural issue, what is a political issue, etc. So I'd like to just, as we're wrapping up here, I'd like to just go around and ask you that, I mean, hopefully sooner rather than later, in a non-politicized way, we will see the end of the tunnel of COVID and emerge on the other side. Arguably, COVID is the big reset for how we look back on challenges. Some, of course, that defining moment was 9/11. Maybe it was the Great Recession of 2008. perhaps the assassination of John F. Kennedy, the assassination of John Lennon. These were moments that really helped shape people's lives and perceptions and the lens through which they see the world. So what do you take moving forward from this era of COVID? We'll start with Farid. I think we need your mute, yeah.
It's not really a Zoom call unless someone commits that error, right? So I can tell you what I hope will be our takeaway from COVID. First, I want to say that something we haven't brought up that I hope we did or wish we did was, suffering is one thing. And we talked about how religion provides you with lexicon to understand and provide meaning to suffering. But almost a more brutal reality is disparity in suffering. So I think one of the things that we'll have to grapple with in the aftermath of COVID is that some communities were hit much harder than others, in a way that really makes you question life. Like, just because a certain group of people were born into a certain circumstance, this event is going to have a much worse outcome for them. So I think that the question of disparity and suffering is huge, and it's going to be a question that our public conscience will have to deal with. And I think, again, the role of religion will be to allow us to grapple with that question in the following way, if I can put it very, very briefly. There's this idea of infinite justice, and if God is anything, he is the infinitely just. Disparity in suffering presents us with an anomaly to that, or what appears to be an anomaly. A lot of people, especially these days, would say this is like evidence against God, right? What kind of infinitely just God would allow there not only to be suffering? It's one thing if we were all in it together, but disparities in suffering in such a way that some innocent people are going to have to deal with the effect of the pandemic much more than others. But to me, the real point is that we do have this vague intimation of what infinite justice would be like, right? We do have this ideal image of a society where these disparities don't exist, and we're all coming together through some kind of social welfare program, maybe, to provide for the most disadvantaged people. And I think that is the true essence of God. So rather than putting a false dichotomy between the injustice that we see in the world and the infinite justice of God, I think the way we should think about it is the very notion of infinite justice as manifested in the concept of God is what we're aiming for in this society. So I would hope that there is more of a space to discuss religious concepts in the aftermath of COVID, particularly with regards to the disparities that we're going to see. And I remain optimistic. I think that these kind of forums, Zoom calls, social media, are providing ample opportunities for people to come together. Needless to say, I'm optimistic, and I hope for the best.
All right, thank you. I think as a corollary to that, I think it provides us to give pause to this presumption that technological advancement insulates us, immunizes us, and stabilizes us better than those societies that don't. Mercifully and fortunately, COVID seems to have had less of an impact on sub-Saharan Africa than it has on the so-called developed world. G20 countries have certainly felt the impact of COVID much more than many in particularly Central Africa. So again, something upon which to reflect. Moriah, what does this particular episode of both your life and that of the planets give you moving forward?
Yeah, I think that what Farid was saying, he worded it so well. Again, like what I said in the beginning about the finite being important, I think is definitely a takeaway that I will see. But I don't think the world will be the same, post-COVID. And I think that we also need to recognize the like really what, like even just eugenics, kind of like the ableism that has occurred, you know, through this, like through talking about COVID, that we really need to come to terms with that. And like that is, and through that, and go toward justice for people. And again, emphasizing the finite. I think that's
Excellent. Kelsey.
I think moving forward from COVID globally, one of the biggest, I think, issues that we've all had to grapple with as individuals and as a collective is the interruption of kind of the track we were on as an opportunity to kind of, you know, come back from the reeling and, you know, kind of frenetic state that we've been living in globally, politically, socially, and have an opportunity to really take stock of ourselves and our lives and ask the bigger questions of what are we really doing? What are we actually working toward? And is that the same as what we say we're working toward? One of the most striking examples that came to mind is, I think it was in February or March, after there had been a really severe quarantine in China, and there was a map showing pollution emissions pre-quarantine and post-quarantine, and it was almost completely clear. And it made me feel like we can really solve the problems that we're facing. They seem, on a global scale, they seem overwhelming and impossible at times, and there's a lot of political and social divisiveness, but solutions exist if we choose to act differently, if we choose to kind of get on board with the cycles of nature and with the true needs of people, kind of like Moriah was saying, about, you know, institutions actually serving what people need in their lives. So I think that this opportunity for a lot of people, if it hasn't like flung the door open to that, at least, you know, kind of sparked an idea of change being possible and sustainable, healthy change being possible, and how we all play a role in that.
Well, along with that door being flung open, I think it's perhaps certainly a much more appealing door to be flung open than what I fear will be people just sort of belching out when restrictions are limited and indulging themselves in libertine ways, as we saw with some of the restrictions being lifted over the summer and having relapses because of excess. So fingers crossed, as they say. And finally, to you, Imaan, how do you see emerging from this? What is a main takeaway for you?
So one thing that COVID has done socially for us is expose a lot of issues that were already there, like the increase of domestic violence, the Black Lives Matter movement, just the general culture that can contribute to structural racism, sexism, bigotry, homophobia, all those different issues. And so it's been a time that we've all had to reflect. It was in our face, and we have to sit here and start to think, what's our next step? And so it can be very saddening and can be very dark, but Valerie Gore once said that this is the darkness of the womb, not the tomb, meaning this is a time for rebirth, not a time to mourn. And this is not a funeral. This is a time to reorganize, restructure, and gather our strength and give it one more push, and it's time for a rebirth. So that's what I'm hoping to see after COVID, and that's something that I kind of draw on to just remain optimistic and, again, reduce that anxiety and find that balance that I think we really needed COVID-19 to really rethink and restructure our lives.
That's a really interesting perspective. I mean, one wouldn't normally or conventionally hear as part of the narrative the need for a pandemic, but human history in its longer form and its longer arc have shown that these are moments from which perhaps the biggest benefit to arrive is learning from it and moving in a positive trajectory instead of just being stagnant and coming out of this having learned nothing. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and thank all of you for being part of a really robust discussion. Kelsey, Moriah, Farid, Imaan, and I'd like to go ahead and send it back to Bob, but not without him telling us what is perhaps a takeaway that he has, not from this episode, but with emerging from COVID. Back to you, Bob.
Well, one of the main things that I'm taking out of this discussion, Saeed, is a kind of hopefulness that as these young people and people of my age, the boomers, try to work out what the world should look like and what the world does look like, that we will be, we're not alone. We kind of have gone through the history of, from 1946, which is the earliest boomers, to now, as a major force in the world, thinking ourselves responsible for how we form this world we're living in. And it turns out that these four young people represent many, many others, I'm sure, who are intent on working with us, that are going to take up the mantle and deal with it in very responsible and deep ways. I was just taken by how much depth there is in all of your spiritual understanding, and it gives me pause, because as I listened, and I was the only one that was just listening, as our the people who will hear us will also be in that same position, I was thinking to myself, do I have the kind of depth that these four people have? And it gives me a sense of both hope and also something that needs, a bar that needs to be set, or is being set, that I need to pay attention to. So there's a good deal of hope that came out of this. I love that image of being in the womb, and I think it may, men may have to work a little bit more to think of that. I mean, that notion of one more push, something that a woman, I think, can identify with maybe more easily than a man would. Yet that is the sense that we all have to deal with this darkness and bring it to life, bring it to full term. So I was really it's a cliche, of course, but I was quite blown away by this discussion. So thank you very much, and thanks for your very clear moderating and leadership on this, Saeed. And so I'll close by saying that thank you all for joining us today. You've been listening to the Faith and Works podcast, sponsored by the Interfaith Leadership Council of Metropolitan Detroit. We look forward to our listeners providing us with suggestions for future programs and comments. You can place those comments on our email address, which is faithandworkspodcast@gmail.com. The music you will be hearing and have heard is by Ben Sound Incorporated, or bensound.com. So thank you very much, and we look forward to future discussions with equivalent depth.